Hey, what's up you guys? Welcome to my channel. My name is Kylie if you're new, and today I'm so pumped. I will be reviewing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. This is the beginning of my Texas Chainsaw Massacre series, so I will indeed be reviewing every single Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie in the entire franchise. These videos will be coming out on Mondays, and I will create a playlist with all of them so you can just watch them all there. And on Wednesday, I'll be starting my Child's Play franchise series. Kind of bittersweet since I just finished my Halloween and my Nightmare on Elm Street series, but if you're a fan of those franchises or Friday the 13th, I have covered those franchises as well. But anyways, getting on with today's video. So the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, this came out in 1974. It received an 89% on Rotten Tomatoes, and here's the synopsis. When Sally hears that her grandfather's grave may have been vandalized, she and her paraplegic brother Franklin set out with their friends to investigate. After a detour to their family's old farmhouse, they discover a group of crazed, murderous outcasts living next door. As the group is attacked one by the chainsaw-wielding Leatherface, who wears a mask of human skin, the survivors must do everything they can to escape. If you haven't seen this movie yet, this review is going to be spoiler-filled. However, I do start with all my fun facts first, and then I get into kind of a vague overall review, and then I get into the spoiler section, so you're safe for a little while. But if you'd like to watch it before you watch this video, it is free to watch on Tubi, and it's also streaming on Shudder right now. So this was the second or third time that I'd seen this movie, and this time I just feel like I had a lot more appreciation for it because I've been watching so many older horror movies lately. And I also found the shooting style and just so much about this movie so fascinating. I watched this documentary here on YouTube, and I'll definitely link that down below. I think it's called something like The Shocking Truth, the Making of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, something like that. So I got most of my fun facts from there. But to kick it off with this uber iconic horror movie, I want to start with the fact that the director, Tobe Hooper, originally wanted this to be a PG rated movie. He kept the violence really moderate, there was hardly any gore, he kept really mild language, and most of the horror was implied rather than on screen. However, this plan kind of backfired, and it ended up getting an R rating regardless. The soundtrack to this movie is actually extremely experimental. They didn't use any real musical instruments, with the exception of some copyrighted music that they did have access to. Instead, they used a lot of the sounds that an animal would hear inside of a slaughterhouse. One of the most interesting topics they covered in this documentary was just how brutal the filming conditions were for this film. Starting on the more mild end of the spectrum, Marilyn Burns, who played Sally, when she was running through the underbrush and whatnot, she actually did get cut up, so a lot of the blood on her body is real. She also suffered a black eye at some point during filming, and depending on the continuity, sometimes she would have to get her own black eye covered up. The company also worked 7 days a week for 16 hours a day, with the exception of the dinner scene, which I will get into. They also filmed for, I believe, 32 days in the Texas summer heat, from July to August. So it was about 100 degrees outside, and then oftentimes they would have to film indoors in this house that had almost no ventilation, so it was probably between like 110, 115 in the house. And the lowest that it would get at night was probably about 80 degrees, so still very warm. Due to the low budget, Gunnar Hansen only had one shirt, and it was specifically dyed for the movie, so they didn't want to wash it, you know, in fear that it would get ruined and mess up the continuity of the movie. So he had to wear it for 4 straight weeks while filming in the heat. He reeked so badly that by the end of filming, the cast and crew couldn't really stand to be around him because he smelled so bad. Gunnar Hansen is also 6'4", and he wore 3-inch lifts to make himself even taller, and his mask kind of cut off his peripheral vision, and so oftentimes he would hit his head and his body on door frames and stuff. He was just having a rough time. But everybody suffered during that filming scene, not just the actors, but the entire crew. Apparently, because they had a real chicken body and they had food on the table and whatnot, and because they had curtains up, you know, blocking all the airflow in there, and it was of course 100 degrees, the food started to rot, the smell was unbearable. Obviously, Gunnar Hansen and probably all the actors' body odor was just terrible. Apparently a couple of people had to take breaks to throw up because it was so bad, and John Duggan was covered in this like old man makeup. So the entire process of that dinner scene shoot took about 36 hours because it took John Duggan 5 hours to get all of that makeup on, and they had to get it all done within 1 day. So it was a little bit unclear from the documentary how long it actually took. Some of them said 26 hours, 27, and then 36. I'm guessing that includes maybe some of like the prep work of getting his makeup on and whatnot, and then the actual shooting probably took about 26 hours. Oh, and I failed to mention there were no fans and there was no AC in that room. So everybody was just boiling and stinking, and there was rotting food. It was terrible. Not to mention, that's a scene in which Marilyn is screaming for a great deal of the time. I can't even imagine how physically exhausted she must have been, how raw her throat was. But basically, everybody was having a terrible time. And it really translates, honestly, because just the atmosphere of that scene, I'll get into it. Also, Marilyn Burns' clothing was so drenched in fake blood that it was essentially solid by the time they finished filming. Entertainment Weekly rated this the second scariest film of all time, only second to The Exorcist. It also ranks at #1 in Slant Magazine's list of the top 100 horror films of all time. It was also the 12th highest grossing film overall in 1974. Most of the actors actually never met Gunnar Hansen until they had their scene with him, which was often their first and last one together. Only one person in the movie is killed by a chainsaw. And finally, many of the film's original locations were actually used in a short film called Head Cheese, which was one of the working titles of this movie. And this short film was co-produced by Kim Henkel, who was a co-scribe on the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I haven't watched this short film yet, but it is on Amazon Prime, so I'm considering watching it. I don't think I'm going to talk about it in today's video, obviously because I haven't watched it yet. But if you'd like to watch it and you'd like me to watch it and talk about it during this series, please let me know because I think it's so interesting. Okay, so before I get into my general overview, I just want to go over the production design of this movie. Robert Burns was the art director of this movie, and this man, the talent I have witnessed, once in a generation type of a human here. Part of why the atmosphere of this movie works so well is because of the production design and what Robert Burns did. In creating the house, there's all this furniture that has like these human body parts and bones and whatnot, and they're really like art pieces. But in the documentary I watched, Robert was describing how he thought to himself, while these people kill and eat humans, what would they do with the leftover body parts? What would they make out of them? And what came out of this were all of these furniture pieces and these like art pieces that Robert Burns basically made all by himself. He designed and built almost all of them. And I know it might be kind of strange to describe some of them as art pieces, but really, that's what it is. I mean, they're sculptures. They're gruesome, but it's dark art. And he didn't even describe it as getting into the minds of these people. He just kind of practically thought, well, what would they do with these leftover pieces? And that's so interesting to me because I kind of thought it would be the opposite. You know, I thought he would kind of try to get into their minds to try to figure out, well, how would they decorate their house? Which you could argue he kind of did to an extent, but really he took a lot more practical of an approach. Okay, so now I'm going to get on to my review portion of this video. Just some really quick overall thoughts before I get into the spoilers of this movie. It's hard to say this because this film has inspired so many since then, but I want to say this is not a typical horror film. So much about this movie felt very, very experimental to me, and because of that, because of those bold risks, we got something that was so unique and also so horrifying. In execution, the way that it's aged, I don't think this film has really aged very much. Aside from maybe some weaker acting and some questionable editing choices and whatnot, this film really holds up. Like, this film could have been made today, you know, aside from the clothing choices and just the general atmosphere would be a little bit different. But this is a film that I think stands the test of time because it feels so timeless, aside from the obvious 70s attire. But I think part of that is because this movie feels so isolated. It feels very much like it exists in this little bubble, this little world that they've created. Because majority of people in the world do live in cities, and so that rural life definitely still to this day kind of has an air of mystery to it. And I think it's why this film will continue to hold up, just simply because of the atmosphere and the way that I think it's so applicable to you no matter where you live. Because we typically fear the unknown, and when you live in the city, you're gonna fear this movie. You're gonna fear this rural landscape. And if you're someone that lives in a rural landscape, this is happening in your own backyard. Like, this is something that is happening in a place that is very similar to where you live. So no matter who you are, what walk of life you come from, I think there will be an appreciation from this movie, and I think it could really scare anybody. Now, if you're desensitized and you're a classic horror fan and whatnot, you're probably not gonna get scared of it. I'm not scared of this movie anymore. But what I'm trying to say is it's an excellent film. Okay, moving on now to my spoilers section. So the first scene that I've got to talk about is this scene. The car scene, right? Am I right? At first, I did not know what to make of this scene, but what I do know is that I think it's brilliant. The performance of Edwin Neal, talent. And I think this is one of those scenes in particular that has held up almost 50 years later, and here is why. This movie could have potentially been a big catalyst as to the whole message of don't pick up hitchhikers because you don't know who they could be. I personally would never pick up a hitchhiker on the side of the road just because you never know who it's gonna be. And I think that this movie kind of perfectly encapsulated that nightmare scenario. It wasn't over the top in the slightest. It wasn't over the top to the point where you would think it was not believable. And the writers of this film just really knew how to surprise us while still maintaining our suspension of disbelief. They still made it relatively believable. The same can be said actually of the scene where Sally runs into the house and we think for just a brief moment that she might be safe. I did at least have that kind of tickle in the back of my mind, like something is gonna go wrong. I'm sure most people did. And there's a misdirect in that scene where he leaves her and he leaves the door open. So this implies that baby Leatherface is gonna catch up and he's gonna run through the door and he's gonna get her, or we're gonna witness through the door, we're gonna see him carve up the man that just saved Sally. But then we see that man walk back in with a rope. It's just very intelligent writing. Another scene that I love is the meat hook scene. They actually discussed this in the documentary as well because Tobe Hooper originally wanted the hook to come through her body and to have blood squirting out of it. But the art director I mentioned earlier, Robert Burns, actually said, well, then people are gonna wonder how you did the effect, so it might be much more powerful if they actually can't see it. And I agree. This is actually a common theme on my channel and a common theme with me. I'm not really a gore fan, and it's because I believe that the fear and the suspense lies with what we can't see and what we don't know. Oftentimes, what we can imagine in our minds is going to be 100 times worse than anything they could show us, which, by the way, is why I love Halloween 1978 to the ends of the earth. And despite not seeing that hook coming through her body, I felt that is one of the most cringy moments in the movie to me, because I just, like, my own back tenses up even when I think about it. The next scene I have to highlight, obviously, because I've already talked about it a bit, is the dinner scene. But specifically what I want to talk about is how at some times during this movie, it feels more like an experimental film. If you're not familiar with experimental film, look up, I don't know, like David Lynch, E. Elias Murhage, they've done some really weird stuff. But up until this point, we had a relatively normal narrative progression. There are some other scenes that kind of have some experimental-ish editing going on. But with this dinner scene, I felt like we really took a step back from the narrative and we just entered a fever dream. In this scene, we have this disturbing animated corpse-looking person sucking the blood off of Sally's finger. We have all these rapid up-close shots of her eyes and then of just her eye. And then we have this super prolonged sequence of her just screaming bloody murder and these crazy men around her just howling like wolves. And we get these really weird, uncomfortable kind of offbeat close-ups on these men's faces as well, which narratively is slightly confusing. I do understand like they were howling because no one's gonna hear her scream, so they were kind of just like mocking her and they were all making noise because they were just giddy. But why it's just a little bit narratively confusing is because we totally step back. Nothing about this scene really is like pushing us forward. It's kind of just we're dropped in this moment and we have to exist in this awful moment for kind of a prolonged period of time, like longer than I think was necessary, but artistically for the story and what Tobe Hooper wanted to make us feel, I think it absolutely made sense. And like I said, this kind of experimental type of vibe does happen in other scenes in the movie, but I can't really remember when. But on the topic of the narrative and pacing and whatnot, a lot of older movies are just naturally a little bit slower paced because that was just the norm back then and audiences didn't have the same expectations of horror. But this movie has a completely reasonable length and pace, and can we just quickly discuss? 83 minutes. This movie is 83 minutes long. Why are movies today so long? I do appreciate some long movies because sometimes they can be very mentally stimulating and give you a lot of food for thought and imagery and whatnot. And I do like getting my wheels turning, obviously. I do that a lot on my channel. That's like all I do. But it's been proven also by countless incredible short films that you can do so much in such little time, as long as all of the moving parts come together nicely. For example, in this movie, we are introduced to one of the wacky family members early on. Of course, we don't know who he is. And in that scene, we sort of get a taste of the madness. We also have the scene in the gas station where we come to realize that these adults are completely just fish out of water in this movie. They are not from or connected to these rural parts. And I do really like fish out of water stories. The same can be said for Get Out, because of course putting your characters in an unlikely environment that they are not comfortable in will add more suspense. And like I mentioned with the production design, there was just so much visual food, that there was so much amazing imagery. So even though it's only an hour and 20 minutes long, everything functioned so well that it feels very complete, and it's the perfect length. My only gripe about this movie, the only moving part that I didn't quite love, is that the characters are really bland. The only one that's sort of interesting is Franklin, because he's in a wheelchair and that provides some obstacles for him that don't apply to the other people in the movie. But then he ends up being the most whiny and annoying character. Not to say that's not deserved. I mean, his friends are not really treating him the best. But I don't even remember any of the characters' names except for Franklin and Sally. They're all very generic, and I mean, at least they're not stereotypical, but they're just very plain. I will say though, I did love their outfits. A lot of my fashion choices are inspired by the 70s. But anyways, I mean, also with Sally though, it's also just kind of a contrast to a lot of other iconic slashers, because she did not become this final girl cultural icon in the way that so many other women did, which is kind of a shame because in my opinion, she went through one of the worst circumstances out of any of the other final girls. Not to mention, she fought her way out. She was not saved. But she's not really talked about as much from what I see from other horror fans and even like from you guys. I don't think anyone's ever really brought her up to compare her to like Laurie or anyone like that. But that being said, let's talk about the end of this movie. Our final girl usually ends up being okay. She usually doesn't sustain any really serious injuries and she usually just kind of ends up crying it out, but she's relatively fine. But in the final shot of Sally, she is sitting there drenched in blood. She has suffered a blow to the back of her head. She went crashing through a window. She is now hopped up onto this truck and she is just, she's not even crying. She's laughing hysterically. She is completely catatonic. She's lost her mind. She might very well be just as insane as the people that she just ran away from. She was just clearly irrevocably changed by what just happened to her. Also with the ending, typically, with our main villain, we see them contained or punished or killed. The movie literally ends on a shot of him wielding his chainsaw around and he is still very much at large. And it's not even in a this begs for a sequel kind of a way. It's just very much a this is not a happy ending. People also speculate that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was kind of the origin of the final girl trope, which was then strengthened by Halloween and then officially solidified by Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street. But I think that's a fair point to make, given that slashers were popularized mainly in the 80s and this came out all the way back in 1974. But I don't know, I think that's mainly just speculation, and that's also basically all I have to say on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre today. I didn't want to make this a terribly long video just because I feel like, especially with like, you know, the first of the franchise, there's not much that hasn't been said already. I'm sure there are thousands of reviews that exist on this movie. And of course, with my wrap up of the series responding to all of your comments, I will talk about any topics that I missed that you'd like me to talk about. But some final thoughts overall. I mean, I loved this movie. I think it's definitely going to stand the test of time. It is very rewatchable for me. I didn't really mention it, but I think just the cinematography and the angles they chose of this movie, they're very interesting. There's great depth to a lot of them, just very interesting angles, like low angles and whatnot. That combined with the production design and everything, just it created such a wonderful atmosphere. It is such a creepy and unsettling movie. And I loved it, and I yet again see why this has become such an iconic movie in the horror genre. But that does it. So if you'd like to see more content from me, definitely subscribe. I post every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I also have a vlog channel, so check that out if you're interested. I've been posting over there like every 2 to 3 weeks-ish, just random miscellaneous content that doesn't really belong on this channel. And if you'd like to follow me on social media, my Instagram, Twitter, Depop, and Letterboxd are all at Kai Johns. On Letterboxd, that's where I talk about movies that I don't intend on reviewing on this channel. On Instagram, that's where I tell you guys what movies I'm watching so you can watch them as well, just in case I do a review of them soon. And Twitter is for all of my memes as well as a lot of my unfiltered opinions, so, you know, check that out if you're so inclined. Go have fun, go nuts. Definitely check out the petitions and the GoFundMe's links down below. I update my sources every single week. I hope that you enjoyed this video and I hope I catch you in the next one. Bye!